everybody, welcome back once again to one of our Q&A sessions here inside the Big Tire Garage. For those of you that know, maybe those of you who've forgotten, here's how it works. Basically comment on one of the YouTube videos. I randomly select some of those comments, answer those questions here on this video, and if I choose your question, I will send you a sticker pack in the mail. Make sure that you tag me on social when you get those sticker packs. That way I can share your post afterwards and everyone can see what you're doing with these stickers. It'd be kind of cool. I want to thank everybody for all the questions they've been asking. There's been tons of questions. Honestly, it takes me a while to even sort through them all and then pick them, but I'm working through and picking them on there, and I'm getting as many as I can. And thanks to everyone who's subscribed to the YouTube channel, you know, all that kind of fun jazz, subscribe, notification bell, all that stuff that YouTubers like you to do. So here we are. So this week, I once again have a group of questions, and we're going to kick it off right now with a question from, so question number one is from SoFlo. So SoFlo's question is, I'm curious about your thoughts on wheelbase to application. I know there's ideals and standards for each use, but everyone has a different perspective. That is probably a very hot topic, wheelbase. Really, honestly, I think a lot of wheelbase depends on where you're going to go wheeling. So if you're where we are here in the south, and probably also, I should say, what type of wheeling you're after. So here in the south, you know, a lot of crazy hill climb stuff, steep hill climb that you have to have wheel speed on and get a little bit of momentum to get up those hills. You want a good amount of wheelbase because you're basically climbing some pretty steep stuff. That's if you're into that kind of thing. The problem with those long wheelbase rigs is obviously the same in the south. When we get here, the trails get a little tight. It's a little bit hard, which is why you'll see some of those longer wheelbase rigs will take advantage of rear steer. You see some guys that love short wheelbase stuff. So short wheelbase stuff, you know, and when I say short wheelbase, I mean under 100 inches. When I say long wheelbase, I mean 120 and plus. So short wheelbase stuff, you see those guys really utilize that in places like maybe in the Hammers and Moab and stuff like that, where it's more about getting through places. Also the Pacific Northwest, you'll see a lot of guys up there talk about short wheelbase being an advantage to them because their trees are rather large. You're not going to move that tree, so you got to be able to get through it. For me, I would say probably, in my opinion, I'm going to say what I have found over the many years of four-wheeling, my ideal wheelbase usually lands somewhere between 116 and 124 inches. That has sort of worked really well for me. Now, I say that, and on all those rigs, I definitely have a minimum of a 40-inch tall tire. So on a wheelbase that's that long, 116 to 124, by the way, 116 is basically what a JK is. That wheelbase seems to work pretty well anywhere in the country. As long as you don't have a lot of overhang on the back, like a Gladiator, which has a lot of overhang, you can get through tight trails. It's long enough that you can climb a lot of serious hills and remain stable, and yet still nimble enough where if you have to get through areas like Johnson Valley or Pacific Northwest, you can usually get around stuff. That's kind of the number that I try to hit. 116, 120, 114, 120, anywhere in that range. Couple things you need to think about when you're doing the wheelbase. The wheelbase will actually change, especially on a vehicle that's got links front and rear. So as the suspension cycles, the links will, if you build your suspension, let's say at full stuff, so the axle's fully stuffed in your suspension, and your links are perfectly flat when you build it like that, when you go to ride height, those links are going to droop down, and that's going to bring your wheelbase in. It actually can bring it in sometimes a couple inches. Same thing as if you build it with its full stuff and the links are traveling uphill, which is what the Comanche's like right now. The links are actually headed uphill. When that suspension's at ride height and they move down to being flatter, actually pushes the wheelbase further out, making it a little bit longer. Sometimes, just like I said before, a couple inches longer. So that is honestly what I would suggest if you're building a rig. Talk to somebody who's got a rig that you like how it performs. So see how their rig performs in your area. Watch how they wheel. Find someone who wheels kind of like you. Don't go talk to a rock bouncer if you're not going to be a rock bouncer, and don't talk to an Ultra 4 guy if you're not going to be an Ultra 4 guy. Find someone who wheels like you. If you are a daily driver, weekend wheeler type of person, and you just want something that's going to be able to handle the trails fairly well and be pretty stable, my bet is going to be you're going to end up right at that 116 JK mark, somewhere in there, because that has been scienced out pretty good. That is a really, really good wheelbase. Whereas if you find somebody who you watch how they wheel and you like it, and you end up finding out that they've got like a 98, maybe 100-inch wheelbase, kind of like TJ area, then maybe you want to go that route. So if I were somebody who was building my first off-road car and really kind of fighting that wheelbase decision, that's what I would do. I would look around, see somebody who wheels like I plan to wheel, look at their rig, talk to them about it, and then figure out wheelbase. One thing that a lot of people sleep on, which is just as important as wheelbase, is the track of the vehicle. So wheel track is the measurement of wheel mounting surface to wheel mounting surface on the vehicle. And I think a lot of people don't think about that when they're building the vehicle, because they just want full width 1-ton axles and they go full width. And if you're using junkyard axles, you're kind of committed to that full width track, which happens. But you can change that with the offset of the wheels. So that is something else to think about. So really pay attention to the offset of the wheel that that person is using, because if it's a 9-inch wheel with a 0 offset, that means that it's mounted right in the middle. That means that basically half of that tire is sticking out past that wheel track. So if their axles are, let's say, 72 inches, wheel mount to wheel mount, and they've got a 12.5 or 13.5 tire, let's call that 7 inches on either side, that's an additional 14 inches of width. That can come into play just as much as wheelbase does. So when you're looking at rigs for inspiration, those are a couple things to think about. Think about tire size, the wheelbase, and the wheel track on those vehicles, and that'll sometimes help you figure that out. So hopefully that answers your question. There is no one wheelbase that works perfect everywhere. Doesn't exist. Like I said, that 112, 124-ish range seems to be pretty popular and works really well out of the gate. But if you're building something from scratch, really pay attention to what someone who's wheeling like you has, and you'll see how well it performs. So thanks for the question. That is a great question, wheelbase. That's one of those hot topics that people will, I've seen people argue on the trail about wheelbase, and I don't get it, man. It's just a vehicle, man. Just drive over the rocks with it. That's what they're for fun. Okay, so thanks for your question. Don't forget, send me your mailing address to bigtiregarage@gmail.com, and I'll make sure to get a sticker pack out to you. Next question is from the Rusty Shoe. That's kind of a cool name right there. I see you use Weld Aid Anti Spatter. Can you explain how to use it and what it's good for? Absolutely. So anti-spatter spray is one of those things, welders will argue with this till they're blue in the face, that, you know, the best anti-spatter is the correct weld settings, which I would agree with in an ideal world, but in the world of fabrication like we play in, it's often not that simple. So quite often when you're welding something like a tube chassis or an axle, you're not always going to be able to stay in that perfect position with your torch. So the point of anti-spatter spray really is twofold. Number one, it applies a coating to the material around the area that you're welding, and that way if any spatter, or some people call them weld berries, they're basically little nodules of molten metal that pop out from the weld puddle as you're welding. When they land on the material, they can't stick. They basically just roll off. So you've probably noticed, like when you get done welding a bracket or a tab onto an axle, sometimes there's spatter or little dots on the weld or on the bracket itself. And the problem is when you go to try to clean that up to paint the bracket, because it's landed on the metal when it's hot, it actually embeds in it slightly. So you can grind it and sand it, and sometimes you can still see that little spatter, basically like a little zit on the side of the material. So that's one thing that anti-spatter does. What it does is it basically protects that material around where you're welding, so when those little weld berries bounce off and they land, they don't stick, they just basically roll off and hit the floor. I use it whenever I'm using my fab table because I want to make sure that the fab table surface stays good and clean and doesn't end up with a bunch of pits in it from spatter. So I basically spray on the table to ensure that that doesn't happen. I also use it when I'm welding something that I know I want to look really, really nice when I plan to either powder coat it or paint it. Example, on the Bomber Fab car, I know at the end of that it's gonna get painted, powder coated, all that kind of stuff. So I used a lot of anti-spatter spray on that just to make sure there was no little zits on the metal that I had to clean up later. There is another thing that anti-spatter spray actually does though. Good anti-spatter spray. Now, some people will tell you, oh, don't buy anti-spatter spray, just buy PAM, it does the same thing, which, no, it doesn't. If PAM did the same thing, you would just buy PAM. Good anti-spatter spray actually can help keep the nozzle clean on your gun, because as you're welding, it's basically off-gassing and keeping the spatter from sticking on the inside of the gun. But also, it can assist in your shielding gas. Now, shielding gas when you're welding does a couple jobs. Its main job is to protect the molten puddle from atmospheric inclusions, or basically junk getting in the weld that you can't see because it's just floating around in the air. What it also does is it had a good noble gas, a good shielding gas, has what's called a high valence of positive electrons, and so it can actually assist in the penetration of the weld puddle into the material. That is why specialized welding practices sometimes use specialized welding gases. Most of us in the fabrication world will just grab a bottle of 75-25, you know, and we'll run with that. But there are times when you would use a 90-10 or a trimix or different types of gases, even though you're still MIG welding. Sometimes specific weld processes will specify a specific gas that must be used to weld. Now that doesn't really apply to those of us who are just sticking, you know, basically standard carbon steel together to build a rock crawler or welding tabs onto your axle. But what the anti-spatter spray can do is, as it burns while you're welding with your MIG gun, as it burns off, it off-gasses some more of that shielding gas to help protect the weld. So not only does it protect the material around the weld, it can also help protect the weld itself and improve the weld itself as you're working. It could definitely help if you're going to get out of position, because if you're out of position, if you imagine, you know, you've got your MIG gun held like this, and if you can imagine, if you can use the way the best to describe shielding gas is like water coming out of the nozzle of your MIG gun. So if you could see the shielding gas, it's heavier than the air around it, so it's flowing out like water. So if I'm welding and I got my MIG gun straight up and down like this, the shielding gas is basically pooling right here and it's going to protect the weld. If I'm out of position and I'm working my way around a piece of tubing, well, if you could imagine that water hose, when the MIG gun is like this and it's coming out, that's fine. But when I come around the corner like this and wrap the corner underneath or move around the piece of tubing, all of a sudden that shielding gas is working a lot harder to protect that molten puddle, because it has to flow up, even though, as I said before, it's heavier than air. So as it comes out of the nozzle, it's flowing up and then immediately falling away from the weld. So it can help if you do a lot of out of position welding. I don't use it all the time, but I certainly would say if you're welding something that you want to stay super clean around the area that you want to weld, i.e. you're going to paint it or powder coat it, it's a great option. Or if you're going to be welding a lot out of position, like on a roll cage, tube chassis, something along those lines. So it's a great option. You should try it. What I would suggest to you is get a bottle of anti-spatter spray, and when you're being a coupon cowboy at your bench or you're just practicing your welding, try it with some anti-spatter spray, try it in different positions. And that way you can actually sometimes understand how it works when you actually use it in practice. So there you go, anti-spatter spray, good, bad, yeah, you know, it's invented for a reason, and you know, sometimes it's just awesome to have. Great question, Rusty Shoe. And great name, by the way. All right, question 3 for this week comes from Kevin Halliburton. What are your thoughts on adding frame stiffeners to unibody rigs like a Jeep XJ? I know a lot of people do it, but I'm concerned that stiffening part of the frame might concentrate more load on the parts of the frame that don't get plated. So what Kevin is talking about is on vehicles like this MJ that's behind me, or on XJs, they're a unibody car. So a unibody car is not fully welded together. And I should say, for those of you who don't know, a unibody car means there's no separate frame and body. So the entire assembly is assembled and then it's spot welded together, usually by robots. And everything is on the body of the vehicle. So all your suspension mounts, your engine mounts, spring buckets, shock mounts, everything. So what happens when you build one of those unibody vehicles into a hardcore off-roader, like an XJ, what happens is as you wheel it, the actual body starts to twist because you're putting additional load on it that it really wasn't designed for. On vehicles like Jeep Wranglers, you don't notice the twist as much because the frame is carrying the load of all the suspension components, engine, drivetrain, stuff like that, and the body is mounted separate, and it's usually mounted with some type of isolator. So, and when the tire goes up and that load from the spring is transferred into the frame, yes, sometimes there's some frame flex in those vehicles, but you don't hear it or feel it in the body of the unit like you would on a unibody car. So quite often when you wheel an XJ, you actually hear it twist, snap, crackle, and pop as you're driving it. Frame stiffeners are basically plated steel, usually 3/16. A lot of companies make them, especially companies that specialize in XJ stuff, and they basically just wrap around the main, what you would sort of call the frame section of the XJ. It basically is a piece of stamped steel that runs the front to the back, and that's where all the suspension is mounted. And when you weld those on there, it basically usually locks that entire section of body into a more rigid piece of material like this 3/16 steel. And it usually wraps around everything, both your front and rear suspension mounts, basically ties that all together. Kind of turns it into a frame, but it's not really a frame. My thoughts on unibody stiffeners, I think they certainly play a role. They can certainly stiffen up an XJ. I honestly think what works better is a combination of a couple of things. So you do some unibody stiffeners along the floor. That will help stiffen up that floor and those suspension components. And then what you would do, once you add a cage to that vehicle, when those cage plates hit that floor, tie the cage directly into those unibody stiffeners, and then you basically have created what's called a monocoque construction, because now you have big piece of basically channel wedged underneath the bottom, and then the cage comes around the top, and if they're all welded together, you've basically made like a big egg, and that makes it a lot stiffer. That's probably going to be the biggest thing. If you're worried about weight, to answer your question, it doesn't really put any additional load on areas that aren't plated, because it's basically tying the two key parts together, which is your two lower control arm mounts, or on an XJ, it's like your rear spring pocket for your leaf spring, and then your front lower control arm mount. It does give you a better spot to weld to if you're building a custom suspension. So if you're doing custom suspension, what you end up with is a more robust piece of material to weld to if you're adding things like link mounts and stuff like that. So in that case, it's better no matter what. It doesn't really put any extra load on areas that aren't plated, because that load was going to be there anyway. If you're worried about weight, what you can do on a unibodied vehicle instead is do what a lot of the Jeep Speed racers used to do. So there was a class in some of the desert racing sanctioning bodies called Jeep Speed, and most of those guys were Jeep XJs. And they found that what was happening is, as they abused the truck through the desert, the spot welds would loosen up, because if you can imagine, if you got a big piece of plate steel and it's spot welded every 3-4 inches, as you're using it and it's moving and it's twisting and it's working, any of you who've cut a piece of metal and it's almost come loose, and what you do is just grab it and you just move it back and forth like 10, 15, 16 times, eventually it just breaks free. The same thing is happening to a spot weld on a hardcore off-road desert racing vehicle. That spot weld is wiggle, 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 wiggle every time you hit a bump. You know, factor that over a 700-800 mile race, that's a lot of wiggle and a lot of bumps, and what ends up happening is the spot welds start to separate. So what those racers used to do, or I imagine some of them still do, they would basically disassemble the entire vehicle. They would take the key areas that saw that load, like the spring towers that are basically set in place on the unibody and spot welded. They would grind out any seam seal or any contamination that are there, and they would fully weld all those seams together, and that would basically stiffen the entire truck up without having to add the weight of a frame stiffener. It's a lot more work, but it does make the vehicle a lot stronger. One thing I do need to say to you, if you plan to add frame stiffeners to an XJ or an MJ, or if you plan to fully weld out a spot welded unibody vehicle, when you get into new vehicles like these, most of the steel in these generations of Jeeps It was called Galvalume. So they basically tried to prevent them from rusting. And so they placed not a true galvanized coating on the steel, but it was a type of galvanized steel. And so when you get in there and start welding a lot on one of these vehicles, you will notice that it's very difficult to do. You'll see a lot of really weird off-gassing happening. Sometimes you'll see a lot of white smoke coming out. So the most important thing that you can do if you're going to be welding on one of these XJs or MJs or any of the Cherokees or anything that has any modern vehicle where you're going to be doing a bunch of welding on that body is make sure that you are in fresh air, open aired space. Don't be in a small 2-car garage with all the doors closed. It would be best if you had some type of PAPR, which is a pressurized air purification respirator. That basically means a fresh air system that's filtering the air and pumping it inside the helmet. Or at the very least, some type of respirator, like a paint respirator, like the good one that goes, not the little white mask that we wore during the pandemic, an actual respirator with the 2 pucks on them, and put new filters on it, because the stuff that comes off these things when you weld them, it's not good for you. It can actually make you incredibly sick. I've seen it happen, and you'll thank me in the long run for that. So there we go. There's our 3 questions from this week. Now, I told you that what I was going to do is also add into every week a where is it now question. And so this question is pretty easy to answer. Basically, a lot of people wanted to know what, if any, of the vehicles from my old TV show did I get to keep? Do I still have them? You know, I answered a bunch of those questions on the page, but this is going to be the easiest where is it now that I'll ever answer. So where is it now? Project Lockjaw. So Lockjaw is my 1968 M715. The M715 really was found in a junkyard, just like we showed on the TV show, and it is my personal vehicle. So when we found that vehicle, I went to the owner of the production company, Joe St. Lawrence. He still owned it at the time. I told him, I said, Joe, like, I love this Jeep. I know that the company likes to own all the cars, but I really, really love this Jeep. And he knew that, you know, at that time I'd been working for them for, I think, 13, 14 years. And he said to me, okay, that's fine. Why don't you just buy that one and we'll just call it yours, and you can build it on the show and it'll be great. So it was mine from jump. I love that truck. I basically stripped it down to a bare frame, did rust prevention, a little rust treatment on all the frame. The frame was actually in really good shape. The bed was great because the person who had taken it to the junkyard had a diesel tank sitting in the bed, and it leaked, and it put this like layer of crusty diesel oil all over the bed. So the bed was mint. Cab floor, not so much. You could open the door and walk straight through the cab. There was no floor. No floor at all. There was a little bit of floor on the passenger side, but the rest was completely rotted away. It was absolutely gone. So I gutted that out, completely rebuilt it, built a substructure, put a whole new floor in it, got a 5.7 Hemi out of a Charger, a 545 RFE out of a pickup truck. We put that drivetrain in it. It has the Magnum range box into a 205, 14 bolt in the rear, Dana 60 up front. And and all sitting on 39-inch red label BFG crawlers. It is probably one of my favorite rigs that I own because it is so stupid reliable. It can sit for a year or 2, you jump in it, you fire it up, and it will make you a rock star on the West Coast. I don't wheel it a lot on the East Coast because I absolutely love it. The body's got like this baller patina on it. Oh yeah, and I chopped the roof like 3 inches because I thought it looked cooler with a lower roof. The body's got this super cool kind of baller patina going to it. The cool story about it is after the show aired, most of those M715s had a very unique lifespan. So they were commissioned by the US military and put into service in the 60s and 70s. So they didn't really see any actual combat. They were deployed all around the world, but most of them ended up back here in the States. They didn't build a lot of them. I think they only built like 28,000 of them. It was a very low production run for, I think it was 2 or 3 years, 2.5 years, I think was the total build time. You can go on steelsoldiers.com, and I think on there, that guy has like a list of where every single M715 is that people know of, because he basically collected all the VIN numbers and has an Excel spreadsheet that shows you where they are and who owns them, which is super cool. So that vehicle, it started as a military vehicle. When it was decommissioned, what they did in those days when they decommissioned vehicles out of the military, they didn't sell them. They didn't send them to like websites to be sold. Well, there were no websites, but they didn't just send them out to auction. What they did was they offered them up to municipalities and other government agencies. They could just request them, and they would request them and they would get delivery. That truck ended up in Birmingham, Alabama. And the cool thing is when the show aired, the guy who was in charge of requesting the vehicles sent me an email because he saw the vehicle on the show. He was the guy that requested that vehicle from the US military in the 70s. And it was a Birmingham, basically emergency management, sort of like just a, like if everything hits the fan, we got this truck. Because they were stupid reliable and stupid good. They're basically little tanks, right? And so he was the one who commissioned it for the city of Birmingham, and it basically sat in their yard for, he said, as long as he worked there, which was probably 10 or 15 years. And then it was sold at auction after that. A local farmer bought it, used it on his farm, and then it was sold to a guy who was going to rebuild it, and he never did. And it just basically sat at his house for a few years, and then eventually it was just sent to the junkyard. They drug it across the scales at the local scrapyard, weighed it, paid him $1,621 for it. The local guy who owns a scrapyard knows that I love junk like that, so he immediately called me and said, hey dude, you're gonna want this truck and I'm not crushing it, so you come buy it. Just pay the scrap weight and you can have it. So I had to pay the $1,621 and the truck became mine. It had never been titled, so I had to go through the hassle of getting it titled in the state of Tennessee, which really wasn't that hard because it had never been titled. And then I got it titled in my name, and I've had it ever since. It's been to Moab a couple times. It's been out to Sand Hollow. It's been to Hot Springs, Arkansas. It hasn't gone to the Hammers yet, to be honest with you. I don't know if I'd want to wheel it to the Hammers because I'd be worried about body damage out there with those big rocks. But it's in Moab, Utah, you're a rock star because it's a Jeep, which is cool because you're in Moab and you're Jeep. And then at the same time, it just works so well. It's long wheelbase. I think it's like 126, something like that. I'd have to measure it to see. It may even be longer than that, to be honest with you. But it works really, really well. It weighs a lot. It's a heavy, heavy truck. I've learned that you can't bump that truck. Anytime I've had to like climb up something and then someone's like, oh, just give it a bump and you'll get it. That usually means either broken ring gear, broken axle shaft, broken front ring gear. It just breaks something. So you don't bump it, you just crawl with it. And it's super comfy to be in, and I love that truck. So Lockjaw, the M715 that was built on my show, I still have it. It's at the house right now in storage. I think eventually I may probably end up getting some storage out in Moab and leaving it out there. But that's where it is. That's where it is now. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for all the questions. Once again, I appreciate all the questions you guys are asking. If you heard your question be answered in today's video, make sure you send me an email, bigtiregarage@gmail.com, and I will make sure to get a sticker pack sent out to you ASAP. And as always, like, subscribe, notification bell, do all those YouTube things. We'll see you next time from here inside the Big Tire Garage.